Well, hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Wood. I'm a professor and the director of the Center for Law and the Environment at the Allard School of Law in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And it is our pleasure and privilege to host this webinar on the belongings of precariously housed people. Before turning it over to our moderator, I will just say very briefly something about the logistics. We're sure that those of you in the audience will have questions that you'd like to ask, and to do that, there is a Q&A function in Zoom, in the Zoom webinar controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Usually you'll find the Q&A, and you can put in questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the official question and answer period. And when the Q&A time arrives, then one of our team will moderate the Q&A. With that, I will just say that our session today will be moderated by Professor Margot Young, a valued colleague of mine at the Allard School of Law. And with that, I will hand over and sign off. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Well, I want to begin by welcoming everybody to what I think is going to be really a fabulously informative, insightful, and really important conversation of deep significance for what's happening in different urban centers across the country. So I'm really pleased to be involved. My name is Margot Young. I'm tonight's MC. I'll be moderating the questions. I'll also be introducing speakers, but my first task is a critical one, and that is to begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Coast Salish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, the unceded, historic, and traditional territories of those Indigenous peoples. And I suspect that there are different environmental or different locations for all of you as well. So I want to ask you to think about, to have some awareness of the lands on which you're sitting as you participate in this webinar. And if anybody wants to pop into the Zoom chat, a land acknowledgement for a different site, please feel free to do that. But I'll just again emphasize the importance of place, of understanding our relationship to place, and of understanding the stewardship of these lands that for millennia the Indigenous peoples have done. So this land acknowledgement, of course, is particularly important for a session that looks at the sort of critical political intersection of politics and geography as well. So Stephen mentioned that there is a chat function in Zoom, and I'll be monitoring it. So please, if you have questions for the panelists when we come to the moment in this proceeding where you can have those questions considered, it would be great to have them already typed into the chat. So go ahead and do that as people are talking. But I want to begin by introducing our first two speakers, who are Nick Blomley and Alex Flynn. I'll just introduce them briefly, and then I'll turn the floor over to them. So Alex is an associate professor at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. She teaches and works in the areas of law and cities and housing and homelessness, and she has a particular focus on Indigenous municipal legal relationships. Nick Blomley comes to us from the geography department, where he's a professor at Simon Fraser University. And Nick has a long-standing interest in questions that relate to property, space, and power, and in particular to the oppression of marginalized people at that key intersection. So I think, Alex, you might be starting us off. So I'll turn it over to you. Or maybe Nick is starting us off. Nick, I'm obviously not very good at reading agendas. Nick, you have the mic.
Well, thank you. And who needs agendas? Delighted to be here. Privileged to be coming to you from the stolen lands of the Kwantlen and Katzie peoples. So I'm going to be super brief, and then I'm going to pass it on to to Alex. I'm just going to try and contextualize the report that we're launching at this event, and a privilege to share with you. And I'm just also very, very honored to have and thankful for the other participants, Drew, Fiona, and Julia, for joining this conversation and bringing your own insights. The report comes out of a project, a multi-year, multi-site project across Canada. It involves myself, Alex, and Marie-Ève Sylvestre, who I know is on this on the Zoom, and also a bunch of wonderful grad students. I see Terry's here. I see Claire's here. They've all been involved in this project and have contributed to it. And when we went into this project, we asked a bunch of very simple, but actually quite, turns out, profound questions. The first question was, who controls the belongings of homeless people and unhoused people, and how do they do it? The second question was, what are the effects? What are the effects, particularly in terms of the way in which controlling those people's belongings might actually increase the vulnerability of people who are already made vulnerable by the workings of colonialism, capitalism, and the legal system in general? And then thirdly, how might this situation be in some way addressed or resolved, or what sorts of interventions might we could pursue? And we began by asking the experts, and the experts, of course, here are people like Drew, people with lived experience, people who actually have been subject to these forms of governance and control. And they told us many, many powerful stories of dispossession that happened everywhere, stories that were deeply traumatic and traumatizing. But what was powerful about those stories was not only the stories themselves, but the fact that people were willing to actually share those stories, to re-traumatize themselves in some really, I think, profound and important ways. And they did that, and they were quite clear to us, because they wanted other people to hear those stories. They wanted those stories to be heard, and they wanted people in positions of power, including in the academy, to hear those stories. And we've tried in our work as best we can to amplify those voices, but we also promised ourselves at the outset that we would actually try and step back a little bit, and try and offer a more systematic account of the regulatory landscape that governs people's belongings and the traumatizing effects of that that matrix of control, both public and private. And so I'm going to segue to Alex, who I think is going to speak more directly about the report.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and especially to the folks who are going to be speaking on the panel. And please do write any questions that you have in the Q&A, so that we can make this more of a conversation than just all of us speaking. So as Nick mentioned, this particular report is a promise that we made to ourselves right at the get-go of this project. It was a desire not just to be an academic project that would sit in a library, but a helpful project that would actually provide some assistance to the people who are doing the real heavy lifting, which are community advocates and legal advocates who who push for the rights of unhoused and precariously housed people all the time, and who are really fighting against the tide to bring applications, to challenge bylaw officers, to find new ways using legal systems to say that people have rights to their stuff and that those rights should be acknowledged. And so this report is really a culmination of many, many conversations that we've had with people with lived experience, with advocates, to try to understand what exactly happens to people's belongings. And I think what's really important to say strongly is that people have rights to their stuff. These are, just like all of us, have belongings that matter to us, some of which are necessary for our basic survival, some of which are important to us as people. It can be our pets, it can be baby shoes that our children wore, it can be a special t-shirt that we got from our cousin. Like, all of these things matter to us, and they matter to people who are precariously housed too. So when we drafted this report, it's, as you can see from the flow chart that's on this screen, that one of our amazing RAs, Grace Lichtenwald, crafted during their time as a researcher on this project. You can see that there are so many different spaces that people who are precariously housed navigate. So people don't stay in one fixed place. Many of us have an apartment that we rent or a home that we own, and that's our permanent address. We can, in a long-term way, store our belongings in it. But if you're precariously housed, you're going to be moving from one space to another, often with your belongings on you. And so this flow chart illustrates how many different spaces you end up navigating, as well as the kind of belongings that you end up carrying with you. So this can include tents or sleeping bags, all of your clothing, all of the things that matter to you, maybe things that matter for your economic needs like bicycles. All of these things come with you. And there's different rules that end up applying depending on the space you're in and depending on how big your thing is. If it's a bicycle, if it's a pet, if it's a tent, all of these might be subject to a different kind of bylaw. And under each of those bylaws or laws, there's different mechanisms by which officials can confiscate and take and destroy those belongings. And so this chart illustrates the complexity that people with lived experience, people who are precariously housed, have to keep on their minds all the time. Again, for those of us who are housed, we don't have to keep track of all of these different ways in which officials can take our things. We can put them behind a closed door and feel like they're safe. So I guess just to conclude with what our findings were in this report, what we found is that really when it comes to people's belongings, there's a lack of secure spaces for people to keep their things. There's just no places where people can be sure that their things are going to be safe. Number two, items are frequently destroyed and taken by officials under this panoply of different laws and rules that apply. Number three, the fact that this happened perpetuates vulnerability. And Drew and Fiona might talk a little bit more about what it means to have things taken all the time and the kind of vulnerability that produces. And then finally, there are a lack of remedies. So even though these are items that have rights attached to them, there are few, if any, remedies that apply when things are taken and destroyed. So I'm going to close it there. And again, really welcome any feedback or questions that you have after our panel speaks. And I thank you for being here.
Just to quickly add a shout out to Nick Olson, who did a lot of the heavy lifting on the actual preparation of this report. And Nick's on the I see he's on the list here as well. So thanks to Nick as well as other folks who worked on this. So just a quick aside.
Great. And I want to correct a confusion that I think I instantiated, which is there is both a chat function and a question and answer function. And so your questions, put them in the question and answer function. And I'm monitoring it and looking forward to hearing from you. Next up, we have two speakers who are going to speak about the direct experiential impact of bylaws and other sorts of laws that govern belongings and their confiscation. And so I'm going to introduce them one by one. And first, we're going to hear from Fiona York. Fiona has worked in community services and nonprofit organizations for over 20 years, and for the past 13 years in Vancouver's downtown east side. She is the former coordinator of the Carnegie Community Action Project, a project that focuses on development, gentrification, and housing in the downtown east side. And she authored the 2019 and 2020 hotel reports about SROs and rents. For the past 5 years, Fiona has provided frontline support and advocacy for tent cities in so-called Vancouver, and currently volunteers full-time for the encampment at Crab Park. She's employed as a support worker and is a board member of the Dugout, a drop-in center in the downtown east side. So welcome, Fiona, and you have the virtual floor.
Here's footage from a global news story produced on October 11th. It shows park rangers going around Crab Park, collapsing tents, explaining why people can't live here, and it's all very nice and pleasant. What's interesting is that Global has sanitized what sweeps look like. For example, they did not mention that Vancouver police were present on the scene. Why would they omit that fact? This morning on October 12th, we were on scene to give people a more accurate perception of what actually is happening at Crab Park and the use of police to enforce these bylaws.
Don't touch the tent. It's my home. I live in it with my dog. Don't touch my stuff.
Don't touch your tent. Don't touch the tent.
You're touching it, and I'm gonna be in it, and you're not. I'm not. I'm interfering. I live in this tent. I'm not living outside with my dog. You're not touching my tent. I'm sorry. I'm not. You're not.
So if you interfere, you're in violation of the bylaw.
What? In what violation of the bylaw?
14A,
What?
section 14A.
Then I will remove it myself and bring it down.
You cannot hinder or interrupt us from conducting
I
our
will
duties.
remove it right now.
Is if
Crystal, I've
Crystal doesn't
educated you
move,
now.
he'll
Okay?
consider whether to
So we
tell
don't
the
need to go
VPD
farther.
to
I've
charge
educated
her
you.
with obstruction
Your
and
decision
arrest
is
her
next,
for
and based
protecting
on
this
what
tent.
you do, we'll go from
No,
there.
we have a minute.
What this
I-
park ranger means when he says we'll go from there is he's going to consider with the VPD whether or not they should arrest Crystal for obstruction of justice for protecting this tent. After negotiating with the park rangers, legal observers and residents were able to pack up the belongings of the tent and the tent itself, saving it from being put into storage or thrown out. And while there is an area in Crab Park that people are allowed to shelter during the daytime, that area is full. And so people have had to set up outside of that area, where they're not allowed to be during the day under the bylaw. Thankfully, though, one park ranger had a great suggestion that folks could just start living in community
Don't want to
centers.
be in the elements.
Yeah,
There are places.
shelters, do you mean?
Not just shelters. They can sleep in the shelters,
Right.
but they can go to community centers and other stuff.
Park rangers and Vancouver police will be returning to Crab Park tomorrow and indefinitely, removing tents and people's homes as they see fit.
So, oh,
64 in, you didn't hear me. What? What do you mean? Well, fuck that, man. That's all the fucking property I had in there. It wasn't drug prep, whatever the fuck you guys are saying. How would you like for me to come and fucking rob your shit? How would you feel? How would you feel? How would you feel? How would you feel though? How the fuck would you feel? How would you feel? How would you feel? How would you feel though? How would you?
The
Sanvita.
oh, can you let me know? My volume's up. Okay. I just want to thank you, Margot, very much for the introduction. And I want to speak quickly about the two videos that we just saw. I think that they really illustrate the issue that we're talking about the seizure belongings. Of course, this happens every single day. It's an ongoing occurrence. Some people have had it happen over and over on a daily basis. I've heard people tell me that they give everything away before they go to sleep because they know they're going to wake up with nothing. They're not going to have anything the next day anyway, so they may as well not have any belongings anyway. I'd like to acknowledge Ryan Suds, who was the filmmaker of the first video, Crystal Prasad, of course, who was featured in that and being threatened with being arrested for protecting her own home and her own tent. I think it's the first one is self-explanatory, but I wanted to comment on the second one a little bit. Just a couple of things that you might have noticed about it. One is that it was raining that day. So the person who is speaking in the video, his home was seized on a rainy day. And it just really illustrates the cruelty and the vulnerability that this perpetuates when people's homes are being taken. He lost his home on a rainy day. They took his blankets, they took his clothing. That same day, it was pouring rain. He didn't have a jacket. Everything was taken. We had to help him find a rain jacket, some way to protect himself from the rain and the elements. The other thing I want to point out from that video is you can see in that interaction, the ranger was he was not answering the question. He made some vague reference to the yards. He didn't answer the questions. He didn't look him in the eye. He didn't interact. It was almost like he wasn't seeing him as a human being who just lost his home. And so just to me, that illustrates like he's not even, this person is saying, how would you feel? And there's just not even kind of recognizing that this is a fellow human that's losing their home on a rainy day and has nowhere to stay and lost all his belongings. There's no answering, there's no explanation of where to go to retrieve the belongings. There's a whole story of, I had to keep a spreadsheet of how we tried to retrieve the belongings for the individual in that video. I had to actually write down a chronology because it was so crazy. It was just so difficult to like keep track of all the things that were happening and all the instructions, and every single step illustrates how impossible it is for somebody who is homeless. He happened to be able to videotape that interaction. His phone was gone within 24 hours. It's really hard if you're homeless and you're living outside to keep hold of a phone. So within 24 hours, he'd lost his phone. He's being told to call 311 to retrieve his belongings. Then they're going to email him a form, and then he has to send it back. And then he has to call 311 again. And then the form has to be given to somebody who, of course, is on vacation and isn't working that day, and nobody else knows about it. And then 2 weeks have elapsed, and meanwhile, he has nothing. He's going, he has to go and put his life back together and find a few items to, blankets and places to stay, and being put through all these steps. And it was just, seeing this process and how difficult it is. And then at the end of it, and they said that, they're making claims, and they don't have to prove, the rangers don't have to prove the claims because it's just assumed that they're correct. So they're claiming that there are needles in the tent. That's why they took it. Because we know the individual, we know he doesn't use needles. His drug of choice is alcohol. So to say that there are needles in his tent and there's no proof, they don't have to take pictures, they can just say that happened. Then they said that his tent was behind a fence where it wasn't supposed to be. That wasn't the case. It wasn't there. They said it was just a tent and a blanket. And he listed a whole list of everything that he lost. So there's no proof, there's no requirement. They can just say this happened. And then after going through this like 3-week process of the emails and the 311 calls, they sent back a message saying case closed and everything's been discarded. And they knew that the whole time. They actually knew that everything had gone right into the garbage, but they put us through this 3-week process of trying to retrieve it and all the steps. And it's just,
there's a receipt.
And there's no receipt. There's no receipt, there's no stickers, there's a list, there's like a.
You got that too, what's that thing that Ryder got?
He got a case closed. He got a form that came back, which of course you have to have an advocate or somebody helping you with these phone calls and all these steps. And it just said completed, case completed. I've had a ranger tell me that they have a 99 or 95% success rate in closing cases, I think. I'm sure they can close them because they just throw everything in the garbage and say it's complete. And they actually backdated the form by 2 days and told the advocate 2 days later that it was closed, and it was his own complaint. So I'm just kind of looking down because I can talk about another case. This was also in Crab Park, and just quickly, it's a little bit tedious, all the steps that were taken, but just again, to give an example. So seven tents on July 15th, 7 tents and belongings were removed. Called 311, generated a case file, then generated a case complaint because the file wasn't closed. Then the 311 call taker said, personally, I don't know where it went. They said that 311 could arrange for a ranger to meet the person. Usually when they're saying they'll meet the person, they'll pick a place like a community policing center, which has all kinds of barriers as well. Like most people are not going to want to meet at a community policing station. A few days later, I got a return phone call from the ranger. She left a message saying, I'll call you back, but she didn't leave a return phone number. And then she didn't call me back. And then when I called again, they said the case was closed because she had called me, but she hadn't given me any information or a return call or a phone number to call her back on. So then I called again, 311, 42-minute phone call. Then I generated another file number. They told me my first one had been closed because the ranger had called me back. Generated another call number and another complaint number. Then I got still no response. This is a month later, and still no response to either of my complaints or either of my file numbers. Called again, transferred to the rangers. I was told my case was being escalated because there was a third complaint, and then still no complaint. This is now 2 months later, September 7th. So still no complaint to either of the files or any of the 3 complaints. So that's 5 case numbers. This was 2 years ago. No further follow-up. That was the end of it, and there was nothing ever came of that. So that's just an example of the impossibility, the barriers, the lack of like just complete obliviousness to what it's like to be home in these conditions, homeless, no phone, having to go through all of these steps. I mean, I think the psychological trauma is, you know, it speaks for itself, what people go through. And you know, also just acknowledging like it's not just Crab Park or any park, it's on the street. The Stop the Streets group has done a lot of work around kind of showing what people are going through, people on Hastings, people elsewhere, what they're going through every day. But I guess for me, I think of it almost every day when I think about like cases when I've lost my wallet or my phone. Every day when I come home, the worst part of my day is looking in my purse for my keys because I can't find them for a second. And I think about like, what if I could never find my keys? What if I could never find my wallet? What if my wallet went missing every day? When I lose my wallet once, I can't function, like I can't, or my phone, I feel like I can't function and like my whole life is breaking down. And if I went through that every single day, nonstop, and nobody would even take my call, there's no way to follow up, there's no recognition of it, I can't even imagine what people are going through. I've heard things like people saying it just breaks down their mind. Like one young woman said that she almost attacked a ranger because she just couldn't go through it again. And then of course that makes it escalates for your life. It's going to make your life worse because you're responding to it because it's so hard to deal with. And I think so much of it is just about the attitudes about people who are homeless. We've heard things like the ranger saying their example of a good camper is somebody who lives in a little pup tent, like a little 2-person tent, and they pack it up every day and they put it on their back and they walk around with it every day. So that's a good person. That's a good camper. Somebody who doesn't have any stuff. Yeah. Just today, I talked to housing workers. There's some new housing units that are now being built, and housing, it seems like anything that's provided is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You know, there's SROs, and then there's like dorm rooms where you can only put a bed. So the workers told me that if somebody is accepting this housing, they're only allowed to bring 1 bag with them, 1 bag of clothing. The room only fits a bed and a little desk. So it's like a student dorm room. And that's what they're wanting, is that people don't have anything. I even talked to one of the architects that was designing the building, and the first thing she noticed was there's no storage in the whole building. It was designed without storage. It was designed in the assumption that because people are in this precarious position or vulnerable or living outside, that they don't have anything and they don't need anything and they don't need to have anything and they don't deserve anything, and that's fine. And they don't need to have anything to go ahead with it. Like they don't need a piece of paper so they can go to work. They don't need a card for their doctor so they can go to an appointment. They don't need to have anything, and they don't need to keep going. They don't need to keep going. They don't need to keep going.
Need to keep going.
Yeah, just keep moving, like just shuffle, like go off somewhere else. And there was the one comment that I really liked from one of the researchers was that it's this pathologization of anything, sorry, that's comfortable. So again, it kind of plays out when the rangers talk about the way people are set up within a park. If somebody doesn't have a tent, they actually have like a little structure because they're trying to make themselves a little more comfortable, or have a few things or something to make themselves comfortable, like maybe something to put their food in or a chair to sit on. They want to minimize that. So they want to limit people to this 3x3 little area. And they want people just to survive, and that's enough, because they know they have to show some little bit of compassion. They have to do that. They're forced to do that. But anything beyond that is I don't know, pampering, or it's like it's something that they shouldn't be doing. They don't want to encourage people to have those items, or they don't believe that people should have those items. That anything beyond bare survival is too much. It's not okay to have those items. It's not, you don't deserve it, or just not thinking that people maybe want to make some art or paint or build something or cook something or have children that you have mementos from, or just any of those things that, again, it's like just as dehumanizing. And it really comes down to the attitude. That's the only way that it can make it okay to build housing where you can't put anything and you can only bring one bag. And it's gone down. It used to be 2 bags, now it's 1 bag.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I want to bring you into the conversation, Drew,
Sure.
and I want to give you a quick introduction before you come in. So Drew is a 45-year-old male who has worked in the service industry most of his life. Drew studied natural science in the university and found himself going from squatting to homelessness to sheltering to tenting to being housed during the pandemic. Drew is a key player in the transition from Strathcona to Crab Park and the establishment of the tent city. And until being given housing in a hotel and then in an SRO, where Drew continues to be an activist for better housing conditions and against the street sweeps, Drew has been and continues to be very active in activism around this issue. So Drew, I think we're all really eager to hear from you.
Thanks. Yeah, I obviously still get moved by this stuff because it's crazy. But I'm trying to compose myself. Sorry. But thank you for all your time and all the different backgrounds and stuff like that. I'm happy to hear the legal and academic worlds are here to have an open ear. Yeah, it's we're not usually the herd, I guess, is also what Fiona's saying. And I think you could even put a human in place of the properties you had on that chart there, because that's what it is. It's not something you can say out loud, but it is a genocide. Those numbers you hear, 6 a day, 5.8 a day, that's doubled this year. Those are expected. Those are on a chart somewhere, someone's pie chart. Those are what people hope for in the housing industry, as in the shelters and whoever has prospects of the next place to build. And they have many names. I lived on this address just across the street for 2 years at a shelter, for 1.5 years there and a half a year at the hotel on the other corner. And I can tell you that, for example, Community Builders makes laws in the city, 4CS, where a profit and nonprofit company can come together and max their tax income at 40%. I know that they have Anhart, the company, which is building right next to the welfare office, and all this kind of things. It's just black and white, some of it, and the properties and things like that have happened to me. I didn't believe even so much as sometimes the people say what city engineers do to them, which are the people that do the street sweeps and that. During the pandemic, I left the shelter some days because I was at a shelter where they allowed you to be away for 72 hours up to and call in or something like that. So I went camping. So I guess in a way, I did go camping, like they say. And I lived next to the Granville Bridge for a while, even as I tried to live under the Burrard for a while. And I lived with this couple, and we lived at the Granville Bridge. It was 2 parks. One is Parks Department, one is city. So we kind of go back and forth sometimes. And one day they came there for the barbecue. It was a Friday afternoon. They said, "We're here for the barbecue." They took the barbecue away. That's what she cooked our food on, my friend. Whatever. And they took my stuff, and I even collected bottles and cans at the time. And it was like $2 in cans. It was like 20 cans. It didn't like a bulging bag or anything, but I gave them books. I gave them all this stuff I had in my tent, like valuables that I think I liked or whatever. I would try to oblige, and so I wouldn't cause a ruckus when they came in that park. And then I looked later, and they didn't even have the bag for the cans, like $2. It's not even about the cans. It's like, it's control. I live at a place where I'm driven mad right now because they locked the fire door that you go down the stairs to get out. And for 2 or 3 weeks, I was going mad, like not sleeping and complaining. But the complaints go nowhere. I mean, I've called the CEO who had the previous CEO's answering machine message on it. That was a year ago. So I mean, you lose hope. Like they came in my room while I was naked playing a video game the other day. And because they're doing a wellness check, which I call a death check, because they're only there 18 hours a day, and I was responding to it. I didn't know who it was knocking, and I can't hear it that well, but I said, I'm 5 to 10 minutes, I'm playing a game online, and now I can't even comfortably do that now in my place, which was my escape. And I tried to complain to them. It doesn't go anywhere. I thought about camping at City Hall this week just to say what's going on, because it's nuts. And living in the shelter, when they take our stuff, I'd have a lot of stuff like we end up doing because our stuff's gone. And I noticed they put it in that shelter system, which they put it in black bags with masking tape. And I'm like, after a while, I start figuring out, yeah, why not clear bags with like duct tape so it stays on there? they switch it around. I've heard lots more than many rumors. They own partly in the wildlife secondhand store. And I know that since that's a place where people live long-term at the shelter above in the rooms next door, we had a cook for all, it's pretty good and stuff like that. They had they do the pest control and the what do you call all the other businesses that they need supposedly, right? You know, it doesn't get done 100%, you know, and there's the neglect and it goes on and on. I haven't had heat in my building. It's a 12-year-old building, not even 12 years old. LED certified, da 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 da. And I'm like, what are you talking about? How can I get heat? I call the city every week. And you know, no one responds. It's like, what do I do? Like I am at first time in my life at 45 and thinking, and I'm usually a positive person. I'm thinking like, I'm here to die in a way. Like, it's like, I have a great view out to the North Shore where I used to live for much of after my 20s and that. And I will never afford an apartment down there if I went back to work and did all this kind of stuff. And I'm stuck in the system and like, there's health issues I'm trying to deal with, which I'm scared to go to the hospital because of my address. I'm sorry if I'm getting off the topic of belongings, but I feel that it's treated the same. I honestly do. And that's the regard that you see for the belongings is the same for the people. It honestly is. I call it a superior inferior complex because that's the closest I can come to it. But it's the same thing that I go through in a day where I look down on something. And that's like a sin or something like that. Like, I'm not even that religious or pious in that sense. It's just, I think that's where the problem stems from, because when I talk to the people at their union paid job at my place, can you look and help me with this? It's morally correct. Like, ethically, you would do this, but you're not going to do it. I'm like, read your union handbook. I've had union jobs. You can do the wrong thing 3 times. And then you're like, trust me, I just need you to help me with this. And then after I do something like this and I freak out, because you end up freaking out about things, then they stop what they're doing. These are just scapegoats, this first level people. We know that a couple levels up. And then they write a file about you, which is all negative stuff. So then, and the staff switches every 3 months in all these places, from the shelters to da-da-da. And it is nationwide, as someone has said here, or you know, international, because I was in Ontario when I first time I touched a shelter, and all my stuff was gone on Christmas out of a 2 locker thing, like all my stuff, years of stuff. And it was all gone, like, because the staff and the people that were staying there together on it. I found out eventually. I didn't get the stuff back, but I was broken. People, there's drugs around that I wasn't used to. I took pictures in the bathrooms of blood and stuff. I'd send it, and my family thought I was doing drugs and stuff like that. And I do speed now. This stuff has to be said. I didn't do that stuff before. I used to be drinking, but you pass out eventually from drinking, and you get your stuff taken, and then you don't want to pass out. And that's what makes people crazy too, because they don't want to pass out. They end up doing like speed or something like that for days just to like not lose their stuff. And some people's systems don't take it well. And we don't have a system, as someone else has said here, for fixing these things all the way into the people in shelters are often straight from jail. Our manager there that got fired, nothing. Huh? 3 minutes? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can go on about these things, excuse me. And I really appreciate the ears you've had for this. But you know, it's really bad, and like, it's connected. I don't think there's a system for rehabilitation that's good from jails. I don't know a lot about that, but I did meet people from jail in the shelters that are saying, hey, call me Sally and stuff like that. And they have no opportunities too. Like, there's nothing in my building. I don't know what's going on. The marathon's going on up front. There's an educational center across from my building. There's no advertisements for any of these things. You go to the welfare office, they say same as last month. You know, like, you didn't do any changes from with us. You know, they expect that. They don't have name tags on. Any complaints I have about anyone, none of them have like any kind of professional attitude about themselves. And that's what we deal with. And that's what you're supposed to do. And, you know, I think that through that, we're going to lose a lot of things. I lived in Denmark for 10 years, and I've seen what other countries can do. And yes, there's problems everywhere. And I've seen the fortunate side, and I see the problems we're creating are vortexing, perpetuating upon themselves, and all to the point that I have to remember myself, try not to like look down on someone else who's on the street. It's inherent. And like, when you see it all the way back in this place where the politics and things are so connected, I don't even know where the answer has to be, but we try to vouch for like peer-led things. I don't know if you said to someone they'd own a building, if they would like, if they stayed there for long enough, like, see some kind of goal. A lot of people, it's like almost not good on the streets to talk about something good, like, as in we say, like, you know, I got my GED or something like that. No, because I don't know, but there's something about the attitude we've talked about a lot that is even allowed in the forces and authoritative positions, all the way Betty, what's her not Betty, but the last general manager of Parks, she even like hinted once, we need people like you, like now they're more militant even when they come since some incidents and stuff that happens over time. So that's another example of how it becomes worse, and they could take the bad news on it and then it goes through the politics. I wanted to talk to the newspaper about my fire door being locked and it wasn't interesting at the time. I don't know. I hope I have touched upon some things that matter to this. I'm sorry for my demeanor, but thank you.
Drew, thank you very much. You certainly add really important perspectives to this conversation, and we really appreciate your involvement. And I think the passion and the emotion with which you speak is a critical piece of communicating the significance and the weightiness of the topic at hand. So we deeply appreciate your comments, and Fiona, thank you as well. I know you come from a real base of experience too. We are going to turn to the last scheduled speaker, and that is Julia Riddle. Julia is a lawyer who specializes in constitutional law, including the rights of Indigenous peoples and charter rights. They have represented clients defending their rights to safe shelter in a number of cases, including in the 2021 attempt of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation to evict the Crab Park communication, and a challenge to the 2022 Vancouver Fire Chief decision to evict the Hastings Street encampment. And Julia works at Arve Finley Law Offices. Julia, you've got the virtual floor.
Give me 1 sec. Can somebody say something else on this?
Sure.
Margot?
Yep.
Oh,
yep.
no.
I'm going to say, Julia,
my speakers
I
are
have followed
struggling.
your career
Julia's
with
just
great
getting their
interest.
speaker to
Is
work.
it coming through okay?
Maybe I'll just use yours.
We have such advanced technology, and yet it always requires active manipulation in the moment.
We're actually all in a boardroom over here. But we decided to, oh God, there we go. Use individual laptops to make it a little clearer to speak. So thanks for your patience with the tech, and thanks for the intro, Margot.
Okay.
So I just, in talking about this report, one of the things I appreciate about, touching on this one specific part of like what I think, as particularly Drew and talking about the experience of being in a supportive housing building, and then Fiona talking about the experience of being intense, should be clear, is a whole system of incredibly dehumanizing behavior that people face when they don't have the money and ability to just rent housing. And I think it's important to narrow down, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about parts of the system, it's all interconnected, but it is also really important to narrow down into this one thing, which is losing your things is absolutely devastating, and doing it over and over is absolutely devastating. And like I've used the example before of like, if you're housed and you have generally experienced being housed, and a lot of your friends are, then if you find out they're losing their apartment and they're being forced to move, they're being evicted, that's very sad. If you find out they have lost their apartment and all of their stuff in a house fire, that is devastating. And that's what people are experiencing every single day. It's not just you don't have the place you live, it's you've lost absolutely everything. And as Drew and Fiona was saying, you cannot stay stable emotionally going through that. It's deeply traumatic. And I think, this talk and trying to narrow down any one part of what we talk about when we talk about losing housing or having unstable housing, is just, this is a widespread crisis, and we're looking at one specific way in which we collectively as a society and the governments we elect are taking something bad, people not having housing, and making it so much worse over and over. So I think it's useful to have that context. Given I'm coming at the end of all this and we've spent some time talking about how deeply terrible it is, I wanted to talk a bit about what we can and can't do, because that tends to be my job as in the legal context. People ask me to give them legal advice and tell them what they can and can't do, and in parts of that you have to be very pessimistic, which is a lot of the content of this report, to be like, the law is extremely bad, society is bad, we have dehumanization baked into all of our laws, and we have a legal system that is designed for people who are housed. We have, in every possible way. That's something we talk about a lot in the fire context. You know, we don't have fire codes for parks. That's why you can always shut down an encampment for not complying with a code, because of course buildings have different rules than a tent encampment. But we also don't have possessions rules for parks. We don't have anything that takes into account, particularly, like Fiona talked a bit about, kind of the process piece of like how practically, if there was a circumstance in which you were taking an abandoned thing from a park, which has pretty much never happened in my experience, but like, what would be a process that you could notify that person, your tent is causing a danger? No, like there's no thought given for that. It's a process that makes no sense. And I think that, in trying to, I spent a lot of time thinking about practical solutions, and I'll talk a bit about like the legal piece of that I think it's important to recognize that a lot of what does happen in parks is illegal. A lot of what happens in housing buildings, I think, is illegal. I think there are very good arguments to say that none of this stuff should be happening in a world where, to use the legal terms, it's often administrative actors who have discretion and are supposed to be exercising that discretion with the charter rights of the people they're affecting in mind. They're making discretionary decisions, and they're supposed to be saying, oh, on the one hand, this tent, I think, is in the wrong spot under this bylaw, but on the other, I could kill someone if I take it. And one of those things should weigh more heavily. That is illegal. We know that. And it still happens. And it's a crisis of illegality, as are so many things on the streets, because we simply don't have the resources we need to stop it. Like we don't have the lawyers you would need. You don't have the support for the people to actually set up their legal cases. As Fiona said, even just the basic thing of people having phones so they can talk to a lawyer, we don't have. So there's that piece of it. But there are, I think, in that context, to move in the direction of some of that crisis of illegality being shifted, strategies that are being deployed and that I think are very helpful to talk about. So one, change the laws. Academics, you know how to do that. You guys will talk about it. Figure out how to change all the laws and the policies, and also elect better people. That part is not really my area of expertise. Change opinions. That is a big part of, I think, what this report is striving to do. That is what Fiona and Drew do by talking about like how traumatic this stuff is. And having that perspective shift from people saying, oh, I don't like driving down Hastings and seeing tents, to, well, I don't like driving down Hastings and thinking about people sleeping in the cold without any of the things that matter to them, having gone through a house fire every single day of their lives. So maybe one of those things is a bit more important than the other. And this is a long time to talk without other people talking, so I'm going to try to wrap up. But to get to think about what it would look like to resist that sort of policing, both in a practical sense and a legal sense. So what we've seen in some of the parks that have successfully hung on to, who have built encampments and been able to keep those live, Crab Parks being the main example in Vancouver, is that there's a bit more of an ability for people to look out for each other and look after each other's stuff. That doesn't always happen, as for many reasons, but Ryan's video, or the video you saw earlier, is a great example of how by creating a space that is small enough that not everybody fits in, the park boards continue to police people's possessions. But creating and protecting those spaces, I think, is really important. They're one of the few ways in which people, in the absence of, you know, actually building housing where you can have things and live a dignified life and have some security of tenure, having spaces that are people can run for themselves is really, really important. And having that option is really, really important. And you can support those spaces, you know, you can donate money. I think there's a link in the chat. You can donate your time, the number of volunteers who deliver supplies for people, who bring food, who bring essentials. You can, you know, donate your time and like leadership, which is what Fiona and Drew both do, of like going there and building community, organizing people, helping people understand some of their rights and what they can do. And legal observers in the camp, like volunteers from the community, also play a role in just doing, again, what that video is, and being present, recording rangers, showing people that this is, you know, just because somebody doesn't have an apartment they can have this stuff in doesn't mean that they don't matter, and that they don't matter to the people around them. And again, I think this is all part of a context of coming back to that view of, you know, we have a fundamental conflict between having a society that theoretically believes in the fundamental dignity and value of all lives and human beings, and a society that lets people go through a daily house fire every single day and treats that like that doesn't matter. But, you know, I was going to try to say maybe we can do something about that. I think we can, but it feels sometimes very hard to be hopeful about it. But I think if there's we have a moral obligation to try to do something about it. And I appreciate everybody in this group and on this call who's trying to be part of that. That's, I think, everything I'm going to say. I know we have some questions. I'm going to mute, and we're going to have one group laptop to make this simple.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Well, we do have some questions, but before we do that, I want to just maybe provide a very quick few minutes of noting the themes that I've heard in this conversation. And I first want to begin by urging you, if you haven't already done so, go online and look at the report. It's a great website, for starters, and the report is lucid, accessible, and original in terms of really setting out the parameter of an otherwise inadequately sort of systematically documented harm that's happening. Of course, people who experience it know very well what it amounts to, but I think that we've had this team of remarkable researchers come together to produce this report is really important. And there are three things that I take away from the presentation so far, and then I want to turn to the questions so we can hear from more of the presenters. But the first is the really deep connections that exist between personhood and personal belongings, and moreover the acuteness of this connection for the precariously housed and unhoused, that the link between personal belongings and enhanced vulnerability that actually, Nick, I think you began the conversation with by noting is such a critical observation. And then the fact that the seizure and destruction of these personal belongings for the precariously housed and unhoused is so widespread and routine, and works to enhance already significant vulnerability. It works through power disparities, and it flourishes because of the lack of accountability in our legal and political systems around this treatment. That seems to me to be a first important set of observations. I want to secondarily note just more details about the importance of personal belongings, links that they have to identity, autonomy, and indeed simply survival for the precariously housed and unhoused, and therefore the physical, emotional, and practical significance of belongings and consequences of the fact that these belongings are taken and destroyed. And finally, Julie, I want to bring you in. You mentioned really importantly, I think, the role of law, both through what law permits, so the role of legality, but also the way in which many of these actions, in fact, may be understandable as illegal, either directly not legitimated by existing laws, or on a more profound level being an infringement of human rights. And then the importance of this work to raise public awareness and to shift the way we understand the circumstances and the kinds of vulnerabilities that the individuals who are unhoused or precariously housed experience. And then this is the segue to the questions. I think the report has interesting gestures in the direction of solutions and ways to think not only differently and to frame the issue differently in a way that's more meaningful, but then to dive into just exactly what could our legal systems do that would better respond to the actual nature and experience of these actions of taking personal belongings and destroying them. And so this takes me to the first of the questions. And I'm going to leave the askers of the questions anonymous, but you can also put, you're welcome to say, if you come on and say you're happy to be known and you might have a follow-up. But the first question that came in notes, the report conclusions section refers to reform and abolition of municipal bylaws and municipal policies, for example. What does each panelist believe are two key steps that should be taken to implement either reform or abolition of these practices? And more specifically, then, the question is, maybe this is how you want to answer it. What's the easiest step that can be taken? And what's the most immediate, urgent, or important reform that should be implemented? And I don't know how you guys want to respond. Why don't I see who looks like they're moving towards the camera. And Julia, are you coming in, or no, you're just coming into the frame? So I'm looking at my Zoom screen. I see lots of smiles and nods.
I'll say something about this. Like I want to say something to hint on the academic world too, is that when Tiger was out there talking with us, that we had someone doing interviews with peoples, she noted, like, she asked us about people that from the addicts, drug taking, which is a large part of the environment there, I must say. And she noted upon that, was it Oxford she went to? Yeah. She noted upon that she wasn't sure that all of her her document could be accepted because people were under the influence. And I'm like, well, actually, you can contest that right well, because none of the other ones said they were not. You're showing that you're being honest that these people were, because she was trying to find out what's the best time to talk to someone that does drugs often and stuff like that. I'm like, well, that's a great question, because you're well warming up to them, right? You could say that you're well, and you have to tell them what your barriers are too, because a lot of this stuff doesn't go. A lot of research isn't accepted. For one thing, I just want to say upon that, like in one way, it wouldn't be regarded as truth or something like that if it was taken from a high or under the influence person, which all of us pretty much are. You know what I mean? In that context, and then about the law and the changing and all that kind of things. When we battled, well, her particularly exactly about this subject of our belongings, which her, another person, protected them when a ranger took them from certain table to certain truck, and she intercepted and went for box, and then was called to the police about striking a ranger. So now we have two different agenda policing kind of things going on here. We have the police, we think, who came and made no report because there was no such, what should we say, drama or level of drama to that strike that they needed not to make a report. But Ranger calls the general manager of parks, who I again say is higher than the mayor because they make more money and they're elected a different way. They're not elected in that way. So she has a general manager of parks banned from the park for 6 months. Perfect, great move, take out the quarterback. And that was her, so she's in the park lots of time and makes an appeal, which again, just like she spoke about before, is very difficult for anyone who's in a precarious housing situation to do or respond to or follow up on, or any of those things. People, even just applying for housing is a bullshit. It's balderdash. because to do that, people think they're on a list, they have to write back and write again, and nobody does that. So 99% of the people you probably talk to think they're on a list for housing are not, because there's no way to follow up on these things for these people. Like same, you talk about like people that make the laws don't live in the place they make laws about. Same for my building. I put out 4 or 5 fires in there, and I try to. First time I was like, I already dumped the water from the shower in an IKEA bag out the window, which is only allowed to be out that much for some reason, which I've taken out and almost got evicted for. And I go to break. I said, "Is there a fire extinguisher?" He points at it and it has glass on it. I said, "Do I break glass?" He says, "Is the fire on the property?" And I go, "It's, you know, I don't even, I'm walking away from the situation because he's not logical. He's like business. It's in the alley attached to the building, which you don't live in or nearby or care about." That's the thing, that people making decisions of our lives, locking the fire door, we can't get out. When I ask security, "Do you know you have to unlock that when a fire alarm goes off?" He's like, "I don't know. I can't get out." Like they're making decisions upon the people. Like the one time they wash our windows, here's the priorities in this city. It is film, exchange students, and the industry of other sorts, and tourism. Because that if you go to school, at any school, I've gone to Langara, and every paper has this part you have to opt out of, which is for exchange students, which pay 3 times the tuition, and there's no housing problem for them. It's fucked. Sorry. And
Drew, can I just jump in for a second?
yeah, sorry.
So I think
Sorry.
like something that everybody here has talked about is discretion. Like these bylaws and rules are written with discretion for officials in mind. And when Nick and Marie-Ève and Nick and I were crafting this report, you know, what we heard from people with lived experience, the experts really in this area, is this need to have officials treat them with respect and also with compassion. And I think that goes to the discretion point, that when officials are interacting with somebody who has belongings that are clearly whatever the belonging is, that's something that's valued, and to not see the humanity of the person who needs that thing would go a long way. So Margot, you're sort of like quick and easy fix. I think that's one of them, is just officials exercising discretion with compassion.
And you know, it's interesting because that is a sort of simply framed solution, but so difficult to achieve sometimes, isn't it? That change in human behavior. And Nick, let's go to you, and then Julia, I want to put you on the spot because I also hear in Drew the frustration around no avenues for redress, and self-help just getting you into deeper trouble or running up against irrational, senseless barriers. And then when you do find an avenue of redress, it just seems to complicate the issue and put you in an even worse situation, which was, you know, began sort of, you know, dealing with one problematic response to you results in another charge from the legal system. So Nick, over to you. And then Julia, if you're okay, I want to hear you talk a bit about what can be done at law about this.
Yeah, that's a super, I'm gonna speak to Julia's point, I think, carry on, but I think it's a super important point. And that graphic that Alex showed at the beginning, I think, is kind of part of the problem. It's this overlapping matrix, and one of the points that we were trying to do with this report was to make visual, to make concrete what are often these overlapping forms of regulation that people don't see. Bylaws don't see necessarily what's happening in a shelter, or they don't see what's happening with the landlord, the scummy landlord who's kicking people out. So seeing that in a kind of joined up way was really part of the problem. But the question that was asked, I think, is a profoundly important one, and we didn't really in the report. Well, an initial version of the report talked about ways of addressing this, and then we kind of backed off, and there were some reasons for that we can talk about. But when we presented this to people with lived experience, and in particular, we've been working closely with drug war survivors in Abbotsford, who have been immensely helpful, certainly with the work I've been doing, and generous in sharing their time. It was this message of respect, and at first I thought, well, yeah, obviously, but actually it's a profound and really wise response. And it's not like treat us with respect as if we were clients. Doesn't mean treat us with respect as if we were poor people. It's treat us with respect as human beings. And that's actually, I mean, that's actually quite profound. If we recognize that everybody values the belongings that they have, and in fact, if we value that people who are precarious, that's all they have. I mean, this was somebody told me this in Surrey. When you're homeless, all you have is your stuff, right? You don't have a lease. You don't have a place that you can call your home. All you have is your shit. All you have is your stuff. If you recognize that, and then recognize, moreover, that my stuff is secure, my stuff is protected, my stuff is held up. But if you begin from that place of mutual respect, at the level of the fellow human beings, never mind the fact, of course, that a large proportion of people who are living precariously are Indigenous, and then we recognise that kind of level of colonial precarity that also, I think, needs to be fully acknowledged. That's to me quite a profound place to begin from.
Yeah, and it's actually how you began your comments tonight, Nick. You talked about the connection between personal belongings and vulnerability / personhood. So
yeah.
And I think the making visible of not merely the matrix of regulations and the variety of places that people occupy through their day, but also the sort of the different ways in which we need to really see what the significance of these actions are, and that it's happening so routinely. So
that's right. Yeah, and the ways in which the denial of that is read appropriately as a massive devaluation of that person and the relation that they have to their possessions.
Yeah. And that's a really core, those are core fundamental human rights values of personhood, of dignity, autonomy, and equal respect. So Julia, over to you. What's law got to do with this? And what should law be doing to give better effect to what we know are these core values we say we care about in Canadian society?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a great question for me because it lets me give the plug I forgot to give that I give anytime I'm doing something like this, which is if you are licensed to practice law and you want to do a legal case, whether that's litigation or just being an advocate, taking on some of the work Fiona does as an advocate, and other people who like have regular access to phones, like send me an email. One of the biggest things I think that people can do is actually like if I can give the simplest example, like pursuing a small claim or a CRT claim for possessions is not pointless for a lot of people. For a lot of people, just having the recognition that like my stuff got taken and that should not have happened would be really meaningful. But what they need is somebody who can actually help them like file that stuff, stay on track of the deadlines, carefully document while they can still remember what possessions they had, think through the legal aspects of that, because the barriers around that are really high and we have really bad precedents around that. But I don't think they're, just on like a practical legal basis, I don't think they're insurmountable at all. I think that there's a lot of ideas and planning that I could talk about that my colleagues and I here have thought about around legal cases that, the real barrier is resourcing. Like we want to do this work. We can't get paid for it, obviously, but like, that just means there's a practical barrier of like, there's only so much we can take on. But like, I think there are really good claims for charter damages. We're working on an unrelated charter damage class action around police misconduct that we've frequently talked about adapting to a street housing situation, and like possessions loss. And there's really good tenant organizing that people are often doing that they just need a bit more legal advice to help them understand like how do we do a group RTV claim so that it's not this potential for landlord retaliation. And I think that like one of the important, so that's kind of the pure law classic, like what are cases we can do? The one thing I can say is there are a lot of them and people just need to be connected enough to the communities that need legal services that they can actually do it, because they're just, and that they can do them and do them really well, because we don't need more bad precedents. We don't need more cases that have been lost in this area. We need people to do like thoughtful, well-evidenced, well thought through legal cases. And I did want to also answer your first question, Margot, around like, you know, if I was Vancouver Park Board and City Council tomorrow, what would I do?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that that is also a charter challenge that we are working on, that they're doing in other places, that we're trying to figure out the resourcing to do. But I think there is the overwhelming strategy and legislative reality of homelessness across Canada is that we pretend it doesn't exist, and we say, if we just make this illegal for long enough, will these people just buy homes
Or die off. That's what they're waiting for.
Really bluntly, like that is what we are doing. It is not, to put it the most gentle way, it is not charter compliant policy. It is callous, it is cruel, it is not the world we should live in. And the simple changes we could make are just, don't make it illegal to shelter outside. Create legal spaces where people can be both day and night that align with the number of people who have to be there.
Yeah,
it's not, so that, you know, like that is the extremely simple answer that is not a big intrusion. You know, you don't have to do the positive charter rights case to say build housing, though I would love to, you know, I would love if that was a more possible one. Just say, you know what, we're going to have a designated amount of space that somewhat lines up with the number of people who need to live there, which is not, which more than lines up with, because right now, you know, we have thousands and thousands of people in Vancouver who are homeless or who are bouncing between shelters, who are living in their cars, and every single one of them are constantly being told your existence is illegal. Your existence is illegal, your possessions are illegal. And we don't have to be doing that, and we're not helping anything. In fact, we're making it, if you want, you know, even if you have the objectives of clean city streets and everything else, you're making it so much worse.
I think they own that place. I think they own that company, MP.
Yeah, probably.
Sorry, Drew, can you lean in a bit and say again what you said? Couldn't
I kind of came with a snide comment, because there's a company that is now doing the street sweep, the actual pressure washing, pretty much. And they are doing the pressure washing. They're like under a guise of a new company, MP, which I believe is actually call me paranoid, but I think they probably run, you look at the paperwork for that, and they're probably run by the same guys that owns part of something else, like the probably city. You know, I see them, and they're a new face, right? So the people that live on the street, they have a new face, and they have a new uniform company named MP, and they're like not putting up so much a fuss about their staying in the spot, right? And it just came in right when they did the street sweeps hard. Like it's just like, I think my grandfather did something for the US government in Chicago. I just drive around with him and check nursing homes, and he'd had bad stories of like finding dog food cans or worse stuff, but of course, but he was a secret shopper in a way. He did whatever. I don't know. We don't have that in this industry, I guess. They don't care to even have that job. I mean, we had the only one for the nation come over from the federal government to talk to us.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and one of the things that your report does so importantly is it really makes visible the depth of the disrespect, the mistreatment, the denial of personhood that individuals who have no home, who are precariously housed or unhoused, experience. So we often think of the absence of a roof over their head, but thinking about this intimate connection between personhood and belongings and the consequence of sweeps that take those belongings and destroy them, that's really, I think, an important amplification of understanding the harm. And on that note, I want to go to a second comment in the questions, and that is a pretty straightforward question. Would it be a solution to have more spaces where people could safely, routinely store their belongings? So of course, they're the larger goals of security of housing, but there's some just basic minimums. You mentioned the basic minimum of just, you can be legal and sleep in a public space, Julia, but what about having a place where people could safely store belongings?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually come up at the park, talking to the rangers about having some kind of storage, and they just flatly deny it. And it's not even like a conversation. It's not even like a back and forth. It's just like, no, we're not doing that. And one of the things that's changed in the downtown east side was there was a public storage facility for a long time that was very flexible and allowed like carts and lots of things to be stored there, and it closed down about 6 or 8 years ago, I think now, and there was nothing for a long time. Now in the last year, kind of in response, I think, to maybe they were gearing up for the closure of Hastings Street, There has been another storage that's open, which I do think is actually doing a relatively better job. Like it's quite flexible. It's staffed by people from the community. And so I think it is taking up some of that space. But yes, I do think, I mean, my answer to the first question would have just been like changing the attitude. Like a lot of it is just recognition that this is an issue, being able to address it and being able to kind of work with people in the community and listen instead of just, you know, the outright no, or the assumption that people don't have or shouldn't have or must not have or are not entitled to have belonging. So just like changing that attitude and the recognition or anything, and recognizing that there just needs to be storage and doing it in a way that where you're working with the community and doing it in a flexible way that's responsive to what is needed.
I asked for parking in my building the other day because I saw they parked their cars downstairs. No, not for us.
Yeah.
There's no parking for the residents, just for the staff.
I was-
For a 96 person place. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
That's storage, I think, too.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on storage, the one thing though is that I think is really important is also though that storage isn't a solution to having your tent up during the day, because that is very much how it's often presented in injunction applications or whatever. It's just like, oh, well, you know, we'll enforce bylaws against daytime sheltering by saying, well, you get a little storage locker somewhere. Won't that be good enough? Where it's like, okay, one, that doesn't get away from the problem of, somebody gave the example earlier, but like I think it was Fiona, of like, you know, people who are sleeping outside are not like on an Arc'teryx sponsored camping trip. They don't have like nice little compact things that they can pack down and carry around. That's like a completely false idea of what it's like to be unhoused if you think that's possible. But two, it's like you can't drag your stuff several blocks to lock up. That's not feasible. And two, you know, rain doesn't go away during the daytime, cold doesn't go away during the daytime, and your basic desire to like have a bit of privacy and solitude and maybe just be in your own space doesn't go away, and you're expected to go outside full time or go sit in a community center for your entire day every day
without any belongings.
Just don't be
given me a book or like
exactly.
have a notebook or
it's just not feasible. Umbrella. And again, it's that planning around like it's just the wishful thinking type of policy making around homelessness, where they're just like,
it doesn't really seem to appreciate the significance of the connection between the individual and belongings, that you can just park them and then go off on the rest of your day without them. So this is a good question. There are two more good questions up here, but this person would like to hear from each of you, given your particular expert perspective. So as a scholar, as a lawyer, as a community activist, having lived experience, for example, what do you think the impact of this report would be? And I guess that is both, what do you hope the impact will be, and what at a minimum do you think you're going to see from doing this report? And so, Alex, I'm going to start with you.
I mean, so what I hope is that this report is helpful for community advocates, and for community lawyers who are working in this space. So as Julia mentioned, there's no legal aid funding for people who are doing this work. There are not enough lawyers who are able to do all of the cases that are needed. And, you know, for Nick and Marie-Ève and I, having some kind of practical thing that could be helpful to them, just to showcase to a court or to an official or to a tribunal, look how there's no space that people can keep their things in a safe way. That this could be, you know, evidence that could be used in court, and reach the ears of officials. That's my hope for this report.
Great. Drew, what do you hope comes from this report?
Well, of course, I hope like that, you know, people of a larger, and people, you know, esteem of people like, you know, intelligence of people of all types get to see this, like that it is real. It sounds like there's emphasis upon like the personal connection. You keep saying that. I'm not going to use it again, I guess. But I mean, it goes farther than all this. I think it's housing, like, and maybe we call it BC housing storage. Well, I think even like BC housing doesn't really do their job. Like like in some way, if it's provincial wide, why don't they try some alternative things like they did in Hawaii recently, like just like try alternative things. Like the reason there's no parking in my building, the reason a lot of things are is because it's transitional housing. It wasn't meant for long-term housing. There's a reason for a lot of things that don't work in that way. And so we have to be introduced to it in the welcome package in a way like, hey, you've got this and this and this, but this is a minus, right? And living across the street there in that place, I noticed that, that company, Community Builders in this example, when I went to the new place that Coast Mental Health runs, I saw Giselle from that place from a year and a half of living there. She says, Drew, I never see anyone from Community Builders. I'm like, of course not, because they don't outsource their clients. They just take them to their other businesses. They have 3 shelters. They have many, but you can live in this one. They never let them go outside of their own business. There should be watchdogs on all of these things. There's no what do you call it? There's no repercussions for the people these rangers. My key worker at my building, who left there, I said I went along with these things like guinea pig, and key worker, he takes me to 7-Eleven, I could have anything I want, and I tell him about my problems, which never went anywhere, and I figure out that my complaint that was supposed to be an official complaint got changed the name of Mike to a third-party agency, and all this kind of stuff. I didn't see him like usual. You don't see anybody after few months or a few weeks. I've only been there a year and a half, and there's no one of the same staff. I saw Paige, who was our previous manager at the dollar store. She literally ran away, I think. I don't get this stuff. And so I'm at the park, at Crab Park about a month ago or so, and I'm going around the day. I lost my phone. I walk around the peninsula meeting this person from Coast Mental Health. She's giving me hope and ideas about what to do about my CEO and stuff like that. And then the ranger goes like this. He goes, Drew, PCA, that's my key worker. Now he's a park ranger. It's just like, how much more intertwined can these things be? Anyway.
Those are really, really interesting observations about the sort of complexity of the lived arrangements in the area you're in. Thanks for those, Drew.
It's a lot of problems with the way it's set up, I think. Thank you.
Fiona, do you want to jump in on the conversation about what you'd like to see this report bring about in the world?
Yeah, I think reports like this legitimize the things that we talk about all the time. And I think it also, for people that I work with, it allows people to see that this is not just a personal thing. It's not just about you and being targeted or you. It's like a phenomenon. It's happening everywhere, and it's being studied. And a report is being produced and academics are studying this. So I think, that solidarity or just kind of understanding that this is like pervasive. It's happening everywhere. And I think just that legitimacy. So myself and being able to refer to a report, and it's not just me talking about it, because there's that othering too that happens. And when either you have the lived experience or you're living in this experience, or you're talking about it, and I don't have academic letters to go after my name, and I'm not a lawyer, and so there's kind of just that othering that people you get dismissed, or it's hard to talk about things. So just having a report and be able to say is that you can refer to this, or there's a link, and they've talked about all these things that I'm saying, just provides that legitimacy and just kind of helps with some of the things that we're struggling with.
Thanks. Nick, what do you think? And Julie, I just want to flag for you that I'm going to come to you after Nick, and there's another question in the chat for you, which is to talk a bit more about the charter challenges and the difference between positive and negative rights. And so maybe when you come to talk about what difference you'd like this report to make in the world, you can feed it into the discussion about how this report might be useful for those challenges. But Nick, what would you like to see this report occasion?
I would like to see it change the world. I would like to see it causing bylaw officers to realize the profound harm they're causing. But I want to echo. I'll just pick up on Fiona's point, which is this isn't news. This report is like, if you went to Crab Park and asked people, and we went actually, Alex and I and Maria went, and they're like, well, yeah, duh, obvious, yeah, of course, our stuff's being taken away. But we had to tell them that actually no academics were actually really engaged with this question. This wasn't actually something that policymakers talk about, except maybe in very siloed ways, which is kind of profound. It speaks to, I think, something quite profound about the denial or a lack of respect for people lived experience and their perspective. So in a sense, with this report, you know, I mean, we're just mobilizing some of the social capital that we're able to mobilize in ways that I hope are instructive. But it's those people like Drew who really are the experts here. But my hope is, I mean, I suppose immediately one of my hopes, other than speaking to legal advocates, which I think is super important, is that maybe policymakers can begin to see that when they join these things up, when they begin to see the ways in which regulation compounds and in really profoundly dehumanizing ways, they begin perhaps to see an environment that maybe when people are thinking in more siloed ways, they're not liable to see if they're just focused on a space like the park, but begin to recognize the joined up way in which, and Drew speaks to this very, very powerfully, the kind of the fact that these are multiple spaces and multiple overlapping forms of regulation.
Thanks, Nick. Julia, and then there's one more question I want to squeeze in before we finish as well. So Julia, over to you. You've got this double barrel, right? What do you want? What change do you want to see? And can you somehow tell us a little bit about potential charter challenges also?
Okay. Changes I'd like to see. Alex already said this, but I want expert witnesses in a very practical way. It is hard there, and I think Nick kind of talked about this, but like there are, and Fiona also, in terms of legitimizing this, like there are not very many people who are in positions of power who are actually like listening to people who are not in those positions of power and saying, oh, you're right, what's happening to you is really messed up. And we like just practical systems change that needs to be happening. And I also, in a very specific legal sense, need academics who have a lot of knowledge who can go tell a judge that I'm right about things and they're experts. So that's important. And this feeds into kind of the general discussion about discretion. I think that we do need specific legislative and policy changes. I don't think, you know, as much as I would like there to be just, and there can be help from rangers or other people who work in city governments understanding, like approaching their jobs with a bit more compassion. A huge part of the problem right now is just that they're not obligated to, you know, it's all, the carrot is you can be a better person and there's no stick, and it makes it much harder to be a lawyer or an advocate because you can't say, and if you don't, there will be consequences, because the laws are vaguely worded in ways that make them difficult to challenge, and the burden is all on people who are actually being policed. Third, as I mentioned, please, if you're a lawyer and you want to do work, send me an email, please. We need more lawyers. I don't often say that, there's too many lawyers normally, but in this area we do. And then to segue, I think all of those things segue into a question of what does a charter challenge look like in this area. So it's been it's a somewhat optimistic time for litigating these sorts of issues. We got some good law in Bamberger and the Prince George and Stewart and Johnny cases. And we're hoping to get some, you know, not terrible decision around the fire order, though I shouldn't say that because I'm jinxing it. So there's, and I think, and those cases have all been in the injunction or judicial review context. I'm talking about them like everybody would know them. Maybe they don't, but they're in the report. So, but there've been some recent useful cases saying, you know what, actually, maybe we need to consider the harm that we're causing when we are casually, as they did on Hastings Street last summer in Vancouver, making a casual order without any notice that destroys 400 people's homes. Maybe that's a decision you should think a bit more carefully about, and you should have a good evidentiary record to back up. And those aren't traditional charter cases in the sense of challenging legislative provisions, but challenging exercises of discretion, which I think, you know, those are their own type of charter cases. And I think, you know, to get very into the law term, there's a lot of development to be done in the Doré framework around how both the evidentiary basis, how the evidence in those cases is done, and then also how we make that analysis work to practically defend people's rights in those specific situations. And then in terms of a charter challenge, They're in Edmonton, there's one right now. There's a number of cases in Hamilton, Kingston, and there's a case in Waterloo this year. They're all fighting cases around challenges to bylaws that prohibit sheltering in various ways. The case that we would like to do in Vancouver that, you know, if anyone from the city is on, please expect this at some point, hopefully, but is a specific challenge around daytime sheltering, because I think, you know, you read a report like this, you listen to people talk about their experiences being constantly displaced. A necessary consequence of constant displacement is that you constantly lose all your things. And I think that totally, and sleep and health and your ability to stay alive in the cold, absolutely, etc. It's like, I think there's, if you know, it's harder to come up with a more distinct example of a Section 7 breach that covers all of your life, your liberty, and your security of the person, and your like inherent human dignity as is wrapped up in that. And I don't think it should be too much to ask to just say, cities, you know what, you have to recognize that people can't carry their stuff with them for 14 hours a day. And you need to do a basic amount of city planning and figure out where people are going to live if you're not going to build housing. And
You're building housing.
it's true. If you're not going to build housing that people can afford, and you're not going to do anything to deal with the housing market. That's a lot of talking, Margot.
Yeah, no, it's great. And we're actually at the point we're supposed to be finishing. And I did promise we were going to get to one more question. And I promised to the person who asked the question that they'd be able to ask it themselves personally. And now we don't have the time for that. But I'm going to just quickly paraphrase the question and ask for one of maybe Nick or Fiona to answer really quickly. And it's going to take us full circle. So the question is, shouldn't people's belongings stay with them anyway? Like, isn't that the point of your belongings, that you carry them around with you? And so I think this is a question that goes to the intimate, important, and distinctive relationship between the precariously housed and the unhoused and personal belongings. And that's really where we began. And that's kind of the portal into this report. So let's have a final word on that relationship from, I'm going to say maybe Fiona or Nick. Is that fair?
Sure, I can be really quick, and then maybe Nick can say a few words. I guess I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but maybe it's the understanding of the word belongings, because when you think of belongings, and maybe this is, you know, some of the attitude is that it's like, it's just what you fit in a backpack. Like, you should only have belongings that fit in your backpack. But when we say belongings, we mean entire homes. We're talking about entire homes. So it's like your bed, your blankets, your shelter, your tent, your tarp, your dog, your baby things, like your everything. It's your everything. It's your clothing. It's things that keep you dry. It's things that keep you warm. It's things that, it's your medicine. It's your, you know, medication. It's your papers. It's like everything, your ID. So it's everything. So you're not, you can't, you're not going to carry that around. And maybe belongings, like, it's not just like your wallet or whatever. Of course, that's what you would carry around with you, but you're not going to, I mean, I think in the Bamberger case, we talked about, like, you're not going to have a 5-foot woman who's 100 pounds carrying her entire tent on her back every day for 14 hours.
I think she might have said in that affidavit.
I think she said it.
I don't own an Arc'teryx tent.
You can't go into building.
You know what? You've nailed the question. And I don't even know, Nick, if you want to add to it or not, but do you want to close us off with something quick, or should we end with Fiona's very nice capture of why this whole project really matters?
I'd rather end with Fiona than with me. So
okay.
Kudos to Fiona. And
all right. Well, I'd say kudos to all of you, to Nick, to Alex, to Fiona, to Drew, and to Julia, and to Stephen and the Center for Law and the Environment, which has sponsored this session. Wonderfully incisive and powerful discussion. Thank you so much. And then I also want to thank the audience for being here, for your great questions, and for your attention. And say, go for it. Let's take the wisdom and the perception and the insight that this report lends to a really important issue and make the world a better place. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Margot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margot.
A pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye. Happy Wednesday night. Thursday night. Happy
Thursday.
Thursday night. Oh dear.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.
Wednesday.